affront to their autonomy, who experience arriving on time as surrender to external control, who construct elaborate philosophical justifications for chronic lateness that frame their disregard for others' schedules as liberation rather than as disrespect. Rohan Clarke had perfected this particular form of self-justification over the 32 years of his life, had developed what he considered a sophisticated critique of temporal tyranny, had built entire personality around the performance of someone too interesting and valuable to be constrained by the petty demands of clock-watching, had convinced himself that his perpetual lateness was rebellion against conformity rather than just inconsiderate habit that created ongoing inconvenience for everyone who interacted with him. Time is a social construct, he'd explained to anyone who complained about his lateness, his tone carrying the patronizing patience of someone explaining obvious truth to people too conventional to grasp it. We've all collectively agreed to assign arbitrary significance to these divisions of hours and minutes, but that agreement isn't natural law. It's just convention. And conventions can be questioned. The explanation would typically be delivered with slight smirk, with tones suggesting he was sharing profound insight rather than just rationalizing behavior he could easily modify if he actually cared about how his lateness affected others. He had an entire repertoire of similar justifications and deflections. The most creative people throughout history were terrible with time management, he'd say, positioning himself implicitly among creative geniuses rather than among ordinary people who just couldn't be bothered to leave their apartments 15 minutes earlier. Einstein was famously absent-minded about appointments. Would you rather I arrive on time but be boring, or arrive late but be interesting? The false dichotomy was transparent, being interesting and being punctual weren't mutually exclusive, but Rohan delivered it with enough confidence that people sometimes actually accepted the frame, sometimes actually treated his lateness as eccentric charm rather than as simple disrespect. When pressed more directly about specific instances where his lateness had created problems, missed deadlines, delayed meetings, inconvenienced colleagues, he'd deploy wounded innocence. I'm sorry my existence doesn't align perfectly with your schedule. I thought we were collaborating here, not operating a military operation where timing matters more than quality. The framing positioned anyone who objected to his lateness as rigid and controlling, as valuing arbitrary temporal precision over substantive outcomes, as missing the point about what actually mattered in creative or professional work. The tragic element, tragic in the sense of self-inflicted harm resulting from character flaw that the person experiencing it can't or won't recognize as flaw, was that Rohan was actually talented at his work. He worked as freelance strategy consultant, primarily for nonprofit organizations and small businesses that needed help with organizational planning and operational improvement but that couldn't afford full-time strategic staff. His actual analytical and strategic work was genuinely strong. He had capacity to quickly understand complex organizational dynamics, could identify underlying problems that weren't obvious from surface symptoms, could develop practical recommendations that were both ambitious and implementable. But his chronic lateness undermined his professional effectiveness in ways he consistently refused to acknowledge. Clients would schedule 90-minute meetings to discuss strategic challenges. Rohan would arrive 25 minutes late, the effective meeting time would be reduced to just over an hour, the rush timeline would prevent adequate exploration of issues, the quality of outcomes would be degraded not because Rohan lacked capability but because his lateness had reduced the time available for exercising that capability. Deadlines would be established for draft deliverables. Rohan would submit days after the agreed date. Clients would have insufficient time to review and provide feedback before implementation deadlines. Projects would proceed with less refinement than they deserved because Rohan's delays had compressed the iterative improvement process. He was 32 years old, had been working as independent consultant for approximately 6 years since leaving position at consulting firm where his lateness had prevented advancement beyond junior roles. He lived alone in one-bedroom apartment in neighborhood that was gentrifying slowly, maintained minimal social life beyond occasional drinks with former colleagues who tolerated his lateness because they'd known him long enough to consider it fixed personality trait rather than modifiable behavior, had romantic history characterized by series of relationships that had ended partly due to his chronic lateness creating resentment that eventually outweighed whatever initial attraction had existed. His typical day involved waking without alarm. He developed elaborate critique of alarm clocks as instruments of capitalist control over workers' natural rhythms, around 8:30 or 9 a.m., spending extended period reading news and social media while drinking coffee, eventually showering and dressing without particular urgency, leaving his apartment whenever he felt adequately prepared rather than according to any schedule designed to ensure punctual arrival at commitments. If he had morning meetings scheduled for 10 a.m., he'd typically leave his apartment around 9:50 a.m. for commute that realistically required 30 minutes, would arrive around 10:20 a.m., would offer some variation of, "Traffic was worse than I expected," or, "I got caught up finishing something important," rather than acknowledging that he'd simply left too late because he didn't actually prioritize arriving on time. The apartment where he lived reflected his approach to time and organization generally. Dishes accumulated in sink until running out of clean plates forced washing session, laundry piled up until lack of clean clothes necessitated trip to laundromat, bills were paid late enough to occasionally incur fees but not late enough to result in service suspensions. Maintenance issues were ignored until they became urgent enough to demand immediate attention. The pattern was consistent. Rohan responded to urgency but didn't engage in preventive planning, addressed problems when they became impossible to defer but didn't take actions that would have prevented problems from developing, lived in perpetual mild crisis that he'd created through his own failure to manage time and obligations proactively. His self-concept centered on being someone who was above mundane concerns like punctuality and organization, who was too focused on important creative and intellectual work to be bothered with petty administrative details, who operated according to higher priorities than mere temporal precision. But the reality was that he wasn't actually producing exceptional creative or intellectual work, wasn't writing, wasn't researching, wasn't developing innovative approaches to strategic consulting. He was just living somewhat chaotically while maintaining narrative that his chaos was actually sophisticated liberation from conventional constraints. The persona he'd constructed was wearing thin even to him, though he wouldn't have articulated it this way. He was vaguely aware that clients were becoming less tolerant of his lateness, that professional opportunities were narrowing, that people who'd previously accepted his behavior were starting to express real frustration. But this awareness hadn't translated into changed behavior because changing would require admitting his philosophical justifications were just excuses, would require acknowledging he'd been inconsiderate rather than rebellious, would require giving up identity he'd invested years in performing. The first significant professional consequence occurred in early September. Rohan had been in final stages of contract negotiation with mid-sized nonprofit that needed strategic planning support for upcoming expansion. The contract would have been substantial, approximately $25,000 for 3 months of part-time consulting work, enough to provide financial stability through the fall and into early winter. The final call to finalize contract details and sign agreement was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, was to be conducted via video conference, required only that Rohan be available and prepared at the specified time. He'd been aware of the call's importance, had marked it in his calendar with notification reminder, had genuinely intended to be on time. But the morning had involved extended social media browsing, then lunch that ran longer than planned because he'd started watching streaming show while eating, then losing track of time until his phone's notification for the 2 p.m. call jolted him into awareness at 1:58 p.m. He'd rushed to set up his laptop for video call, had logged into the meeting link at 2:03 p.m., had found the virtual waiting room empty, no one else was there. He'd waited several minutes, increasingly confused, before receiving email from the nonprofit's executive director, "We waited until 2:12 and you didn't join. We've decided to move forward with a different consultant who we feel we can rely on to be available when needed. Best wishes in your work." The message was professional, final, offered no opportunity for appeal or explanation. Rohan had immediately called the executive director, had gotten voicemail, had left message apologizing for technical difficulties and asking to reschedule. Never received response. His initial reaction had been anger, at the nonprofit for being inflexible, at the technology for supposedly failing, though he knew the failure had been his lateness rather than technical malfunction, at the unfairness of losing $25,000 contract over 12-minute delay. He'd vented to a friend that evening about how organizations claimed to value strategic thinking but then made decisions based on arbitrary temporal precision rather than on actual consultant capability. The friend had responded with less sympathy than Rohan had expected. Maybe they valued strategic thinking from someone who could actually show up when they said they would. The comment had stung, had created brief moment of self-reflection that Rohan had quickly suppressed by doubling down on his justifications. The nonprofit was probably too rigid to work with anyway, was probably the kind of organization that valued process over outcomes, was probably dodging a bullet by not being locked into 3-month contract with people who were too conventional to appreciate his approach. A second opportunity fell through in mid-October. Small business that Rohan had done previous work for had referred him to their accountant who was looking for consultant to help with business development strategy. The accountant had scheduled lunch meeting to discuss potential project, had chosen restaurant convenient to his office, had confirmed the 12:30 p.m. time via email. Rohan had arrived at 12:47 p.m., not dramatically late by his standards, just standard 15 to 20 minute delay that characterized most of his appointments. The accountant had already ordered, had already eaten half his lunch, had clearly been waiting with increasing frustration. The meeting had proceeded but with tension that Rohan had noticed but had attributed to the accountant's personality rather than to his own lateness. They discussed the potential project, Rohan had outlined his approach, accountant had said he'd be in touch. A week later Rohan received brief email, "I've decided to handle the business development internally. Thank you for your time." No explanation, no feedback, just polite closure. Rohan had felt growing unease about these lost opportunities but had continued treating his lateness as defensible rather than as problem requiring correction. The unease expressed itself as irritability with clients who were too demanding, as complaints about how difficult it was to sustain freelance career when organizations made decisions based on superficial factors rather than on substantive capability, as vague plans to transition into different kind of work that would be more compatible with his approach to time management. But the warnings were accumulating faster than Rohan could rationalize them away. A long-term client who'd tolerated his lateness for years sent email in November requesting that future meetings be conducted via written communication rather than scheduled calls because coordinating timing has become too difficult. The phrasing was diplomatic but the message was clear. The client was tired of waiting for Rohan, was opting out of real-time interaction rather than continuing to accommodate his chronic lateness. Another professional contact who'd previously referred work to Rohan stopped responding to his emails. When Rohan finally reached her by phone, she explained with uncomfortable directness, "I can't keep recommending you to people and then having them tell me you showed up late or missed deadlines. It makes me look bad. I think you're talented but I need to protect my own reputation." The honesty was painful precisely because it was accurate, because it named dynamic that Rohan had been avoiding acknowledging, that his lateness wasn't just affecting him, was affecting people who'd supported him, was creating costs for others that extended beyond just the inconvenience of waiting. These professional consequences were creating financial pressure that Rohan couldn't entirely ignore or rationalize. His income for the fall had been substantially lower than the previous year, was barely covering his rent and expenses, was eliminating any buffer against unexpected costs. He'd had to dip into savings, modest savings he'd accumulated during better periods, to cover basic living expenses in November. The trajectory was clearly unsustainable but Rohan remained trapped in the psychological investment he'd made in his identity as someone who was above conventional time management, remained unwilling to admit that his philosophical justifications were just elaborate excuses for inconsiderate behavior. The invitation had arrived in July, 5 months before the December wedding date. Maya Clarke, Rohan's younger sister by 3 years, was marrying her partner of 4 years in ceremony that would be held at Botanical Garden on the city's outskirts, would include approximately 80 guests, would represent culmination of months of careful planning and significant financial investment by Maya and her partner who were paying for the wedding themselves rather than relying on family support. Maya and Rohan's relationship had been complicated by his chronic lateness throughout their lives. She'd been the responsible sibling, had arrived on time to family gatherings, had met deadlines, had maintained organized approach to her work as elementary school teacher and to her personal life generally. Rohan's lateness had been source of ongoing tension, had created countless instances where family events had been delayed waiting for him, where Maya had covered for his absences or had made excuses to their parents about why Rohan wasn't present when expected. When Maya had asked Rohan to be part of the wedding, not in formal role like groomsman but just as family member whose presence mattered, she'd made one explicit request, "Please, Rohan, just be on time. I know that's difficult for you. I know you have your whole philosophy about time being a construct or whatever. But this is important to me. I'm asking you for this one thing. Just be there when the ceremony starts. That's all I need from you." Rohan had agreed easily, had assured her he'd be there early, had even joked about setting multiple alarms to ensure punctuality. Maya had looked at him with expression mixing hope and skepticism, had clearly wanted to believe him but had been disappointed too many times before to fully trust his assurances. "I'm serious, Rohan. This really matters to me. More than you probably realize." Her tone had carried weight that Rohan had noticed but hadn't fully absorbed, had registered as his sister being characteristically earnest about something he considered relatively minor. The wedding was scheduled for Saturday, December 12th, ceremony beginning at 2 p.m. The botanical garden was approximately 45 minutes from Rohan's apartment by car under normal traffic conditions, probably closer to an hour if traffic was heavy as it often was on Saturday afternoons. Rohan's plan, to the extent he'd actually planned, was to leave his apartment around 12:45 p.m., which would provide adequate time even if traffic was somewhat heavy, which would ensure arrival well before the 2 p.m. ceremony start. The morning of December 12th, Rohan woke around 9:30 a.m., later than he'd vaguely intended but not dramatically so, still leaving plenty of time to prepare and depart by 12:45. He made coffee, sat down with his laptop to check emails and social media while drinking it, got absorbed in an article about philosophical approaches to time management that seemed to validate his own perspectives, spent 45 minutes reading and feeling intellectually satisfied about his approach. Around 10:45 a.m. he showered, took his time because the hot water felt good and because he had no particular urgency given how much time remained before he needed to leave. After showering he discovered he needed to iron the shirt he'd planned to wear, had forgotten it was wrinkled, hadn't prepared his clothing the previous evening as more organized person might have done. Spent 15 minutes setting up ironing board and carefully ironing the shirt, longer than necessary because he was distracted by podcast he'd started playing while ironing. Around 11:30 a.m., dressed and theoretically ready to leave whenever appropriate, Rohan sat down to respond to a few work emails that had arrived overnight, told himself he'd just handle these quickly before departing. Got drawn into extended email exchange with potential client who was asking questions about his availability and rates, exchange that consumed 35 minutes as it evolved from simple inquiry into detailed discussion about project scope and timeline. At 12:15 p.m., Rohan finally looked at his phone and registered the time with mild surprise, had lost track while engaged in email exchange, now had 30 minutes before his planned departure time. Still adequate, though the buffer was tighter than he'd intended. He made quick sandwich for lunch, ate while scrolling through social media, came across meme about people who stress about being on time and found it amusing enough to send to several friends with joking commentary about how these anxious punctual people needed to relax. At 12:45 p.m., his planned departure time, Rohan was still in his apartment, still finishing his sandwich, still scrolling through social media responses to the meme he'd shared. He rationalized that leaving a few minutes late wouldn't matter given that he'd built in some buffer time, that traffic probably wouldn't be as heavy as he'd estimated, that arriving at 1:50 or 1:55 instead of arriving at 1:30 or 1:40 wasn't meaningfully different since he just needed to be there before 2 p.m. when the ceremony started. He finally left his apartment at 1:02 p.m. nearly 20 minutes later than his already inadequate planned departure time, leaving only 58 minutes to complete 45 to 60-minute drive. The rationalization was that he'd probably underestimated how quickly he could drive, that the traffic estimate had been conservative, that everything would work out fine because it usually did when he cut things close, traffic was heavy. Saturday afternoon, holiday shopping season, major arterial routes congested with people running errands and traveling to various weekend activities. What should have been 45-minute drive extended to 70 minutes as Rohan sat in traffic, watching the dashboard clock advance, feeling increasing anxiety as he realized he wasn't going to make it on time, composing and discarding various text messages to Maya explaining that he was running a few minutes late but would definitely be there. He arrived at the Botanical Garden at 2:12 p.m. 12 minutes after the ceremony's scheduled start time. Parked quickly, walked rapidly toward the building where the ceremony was being held. Entered through side door that brought him into the back of the ceremony space where approximately 80 guests were seated watching Maya and her partner exchange vows at the front of the room. The ceremony was underway. Rohan stood at the back, breathing heavily from his rapid walk, watching his sister's wedding ceremony that he'd missed the beginning of, that he'd promised her he'd be on time for, that she'd explicitly asked him to prioritize despite his chronic disregard for time. He found a seat in the last row, tried to settle quietly, was aware that several people had noticed his late arrival, was aware that Maya at the front of the room facing her partner probably didn't know he'd arrived late but would learn about it afterward from guests who'd noticed. After the ceremony concluded, after the guests had moved to the reception area for cocktails and celebration, Rohan found Maya. She was surrounded by well-wishers, was smiling and thanking people for attending, was performing the social role of bride graciously receiving guests' congratulations and good wishes. When she saw Rohan approaching, her smile didn't falter but something shifted in her eyes, recognition, disappointment, resignation. He waited until there was brief gap in the stream of well-wishers, then stepped forward to hug her. "Maya, I'm so sorry I was late. Traffic was..." "It's fine," she said, her voice perfectly controlled, her expression carefully neutral. "Thank you for coming." She hugged him politely, professionally, the way you'd hug a distant acquaintance rather than a brother. The hug lasted appropriate amount of time, was appropriate pressure, communicated nothing beyond basic social courtesy. "Maya, really, I'm sorry. I should have left earlier. Rohan, it's fine. Really. I'm glad you're here now. Thank you for making the effort." Her tone was gracious, was generous, was completely closed. She wasn't angry. Anger would have suggested she still had emotional investment in his behavior, still believed he might change. She was just done. Done expecting anything from him, done being disappointed by his chronic lateness, done caring enough to express genuine emotion about his failures. She turned back to other guests, engaging with them warmly, leaving Rohan standing there with his incomplete apology and his rationalizations that no one wanted to hear. He remained at the reception for approximately 90 minutes, made small talk with relatives and Maya's friends, drank champagne and ate hors d'oeuvres, performed appropriate wedding guest behavior while feeling increasingly hollow. He left without saying extended goodbye to Maya. She was engaged with other guests, seemed perfectly content not to have further conversation with him, seemed to have already integrated his lateness and moved past it in the way you move past minor disappointments that aren't worth extended attention. He drove home feeling worse than he'd expected to feel, feeling like something had shifted in his relationship with his sister in ways he couldn't quite articulate but that felt permanent and irreversible. Over the following days, Rohan expected angry phone call or confrontational email from Maya expressing her disappointment about his lateness. The expected confrontation didn't come. Maya sent brief thank you text for attending the wedding, made no mention of his lateness, maintained polite distance that was more painful than anger would have been. When Rohan called her a week later to discuss family holiday plans, she was friendly but brief, was clearly busy with other things, didn't extend the conversation beyond necessary logistical coordination. The silence was revealing something that Rohan was slowly being forced to recognize, that his chronic lateness had created accumulated damage to relationships that he'd been ignoring or minimizing, that people he cared about had been absorbing the costs of his behavior for years until those costs had exceeded their willingness to continue tolerating him, that his philosophical justifications about time being a construct hadn't protected him from the relational consequences of treating other people's time as less valuable than his own convenience. Rohan had a routine of stopping at small cafe called Morning Light on his walk from his apartment to the subway station he used for client meetings and other professional obligations that required commuting into the city center. The cafe was operated by an elderly man named Vincent whose age Rohan had never established but who appeared to be in his 70s, who'd been running the cafe for at least the 15 years since Rohan had moved to the neighborhood, who maintained modest operations serving coffee and pastries to neighborhood residents and commuters passing through. Vincent had always been friendly to Rohan, had learned to prepare his usual order, large dark roast coffee, black, no sugar, without being asked, had engaged in brief pleasant exchanges during the transaction that had never extended to actual conversation but that had created familiar comfortable routine. Rohan had always intended to actually talk with Vincent, to ask about his life and the cafe's history, to engage beyond the transactional coffee purchase. But there was always time pressure, always running slightly late for wherever he was going, always needing to grab coffee quickly and continue to the subway, always planning to stop and chat, next time, when he had more time available. The pattern had persisted for years. Rohan would enter morning light, Vincent would greet him warmly, would prepare his coffee, Rohan would pay and exchange brief pleasantries, would say something like, "I should stop and actually talk sometime," or, "We should catch up properly one of these days." Vincent would smile and say, "Anytime you're available," and Rohan would leave with his coffee, already focused on whatever he was heading toward, already forgetting the vague intention to return and have actual conversation. In early January, approximately 3 weeks after his sister's wedding, Rohan approached morning light during his normal morning routine and found the cafe closed. Not just closed for the day, actually shuttered, with handwritten sign taped to the door, "Closed indefinitely due to owner illness. Thank you to all our loyal customers for 15 wonderful years." The sign was dated December 18th, approximately 3 weeks earlier, meaning the cafe had been closed for weeks without Rohan noticing because he'd been traveling for year-end holidays and hadn't been following his normal routine. Rohan stood reading the sign, feeling unexpected sadness and concern about Vincent's illness, wondering how serious it was and whether Vincent would recover and reopen the cafe or whether this closure was permanent. He realized he had no way to contact Vincent, had never exchanged phone numbers or email addresses, had never established relationship beyond the transactional coffee purchases, had no way to express concern or offer support or even to learn what had happened. He asked at the neighboring business, a dry cleaner that had been there as long as the cafe had, and learned that Vincent had suffered stroke in mid-December, had been hospitalized, was now in rehabilitation facility but was unlikely to return to operating the cafe given his age and the stroke's severity. The dry cleaner owner said this with sadness, mentioned that Vincent had been fixture in the neighborhood for decades, mentioned that many regular customers had been asking about him and sending well wishes through neighbors who had better contact information than the cafe's transactional customers had possessed. Rohan walked away from the closed cafe feeling complicated emotions he struggled to name. Grief about Vincent's illness, though calling it grief felt presumptuous given that he'd never actually known Vincent beyond the minimal coffee transaction relationship. Regret about never having the conversation he'd always intended to have, never asking about Vincent's life and history, never treating the cafe as more than convenient coffee source on his commute route. Guilt about all the next times that had never materialized, all the vague intentions that had never been acted upon because there was always something more pressing or because actually stopping and talking would have required disrupting his routine and being late for wherever he was going. But beneath these specific emotions was growing recognition that the pattern with Vincent was same pattern that characterized his relationship with his sister and with his professional contacts and with most people in his life, perpetual deferral, constant postponement, endless next times, that assumed time was infinite and that opportunities for connection would always remain available. The assumption had been wrong. Vincent's cafe was closed. Maya had moved past caring about Rohan's apologies. Professional opportunities had evaporated. Time hadn't been infinite, it had been running out while Rohan had been treating it as inexhaustible resource that would always accommodate his chronic lateness. Over the following weeks, Rohan found himself noticing time differently. Not dramatically, not with sudden complete transformation of behavior, but with growing awareness of the gap between his assumptions about time and time's actual operation. He'd assumed time would wait for him, that meetings would accommodate his late arrivals, that deadlines could be flexible, that people would remain available for the conversations he kept postponing. But time didn't wait. Meetings started without him. Deadlines passed. People moved on. He bought a watch in late January. Nothing expensive or elaborate, just basic digital watch with clear time display, purchased from pharmacy for $23. He'd never worn watch before, had always relied on his phone for time information, had considered watches to be unnecessary accessories that symbolized submission to temporal control. But the watch on his wrist created constant awareness of time's passage in ways that checking his phone hadn't created, made it harder to lose track of time while absorbed in emails or social media, made the flow of minutes more tangible and immediate. The watch didn't immediately cure his lateness. Chronic habits don't reverse through single purchase or through sudden realization. But it began creating small behavioral changes that accumulated over weeks and months. He'd check the watch while getting ready in the morning, would notice that he was cutting things too close, would sometimes actually leave earlier than his previous patterns. He'd check it during meetings and email sessions, would notice when he was letting minor tasks expand to consume time he'd needed for other obligations, would sometimes actually stop what he was doing to ensure he could be on time for next commitment. The changes were gradual and imperfect. He was still late sometimes. Old habits and deep psychological investments in his identity as someone who wasn't controlled by conventional time management didn't disappear immediately. But the frequency and severity of his lateness decreased marginally. Instead of being 20 to 30 minutes late to most appointments, he was 5 to 10 minutes late to some and on time to others. Instead of missing deadlines by days, he was completing work near the due dates if not always exactly on time. More importantly, his internal monologue about lateness was shifting. He was catching himself making the same old justifications, time is a construct, creative people don't follow schedules, and was recognizing them as defensive excuses rather than as philosophical insights. Was noticing how his lateness affected other people rather than just focusing on his own convenience. Was developing capacity to feel appropriate guilt and shame about inconveniencing others rather than immediately deflecting responsibility through elaborate rationalizations. He apologized to his sister in February, not with explanations or justifications but with simple acknowledgement, "I'm sorry I was late to your wedding. I know you asked me for that one thing and I failed to do it. I've been terrible about respecting your time and everyone else's time. I'm working on changing that, but I know that doesn't fix the past." Maya had accepted the apology with cautious warmth, had acknowledged that she appreciated hearing it, had not immediately restored their relationship to previous intimacy but had left door open for gradual rebuilding. He sent email to the nonprofit executive director who'd cancelled his contract after his 12-minute delay, not asking for reconsideration but just acknowledging that their decision had been appropriate. "I wanted to reach out to say I understand why you chose to work with a different consultant. My lateness was unprofessional and disrespectful of your time. I've been working on changing this pattern. I hope your strategic planning work has gone well." Received brief polite response thanking him for the message and wishing him well. Rohan's life continued without dramatic transformation or complete redemption. His consulting work remained irregular, some months were financially adequate, others were challenging, the overall trajectory was still somewhat precarious though perhaps slightly more stable than it had been when his chronic lateness had been actively driving away professional opportunities. His relationship with Maya was slowly improving, they spoke more regularly, the conversations were warmer, the accumulated resentment from years of his lateness was gradually being addressed though full repair would take considerable time. He still struggled with time management, still sometimes fell into old patterns of leaving too late or underestimating how long tasks would take or getting absorbed in distractions that consumed time he'd needed for other obligations. The watch on his wrist was helpful but wasn't magic solution, was just tool that created awareness, that reminded him constantly that time was passing whether he was paying attention to it or not, that his choices about how to use time had consequences that accumulated even when he wasn't noticing them. But he was trying. Was actually attempting to change behavior that he'd spent decades defending and rationalizing. Was accepting that his philosophical justifications about time being a construct hadn't actually been sophisticated insights but had just been elaborate excuses for inconsiderate behavior. Was recognizing that respecting other people's time was basic courtesy rather than surrender to conventional tyranny, was form of care rather than form of oppression. The closed cafe remained closed. Vincent, Rohan eventually learned through neighborhood gossip, had moved to assisted living facility, his stroke recovery had been partial, he wouldn't be returning to operate Morning Light. The space was eventually rented to different business, a boutique selling artisanal goods to the neighborhood's increasingly affluent residents, the kind of business that characterized gentrification's advance. Rohan missed the cafe, missed Vincent's friendly morning greetings, missed the opportunity he'd squandered to actually know the person who'd been providing his morning coffee for years. The loss was permanent. Couldn't be recovered through changed behavior or belated recognition of what had mattered. Could only be learned from, could only inform how Rohan approached similar situations going forward, could only serve as reminder that time was actually finite, that opportunities for connection didn't remain perpetually available, that next time assumed there would be next time rather than recognizing that sometimes there wouldn't be. 2 years after buying the watch, Rohan was still wearing it, still checking it regularly, still using it as tool for managing his relationship with time. Was still imperfect in his punctuality but was substantially better than he'd been. Was occasionally on time for meetings, was usually only slightly late rather than dramatically late, was generally meeting deadlines rather than routinely missing them. The improvement wasn't spectacular but it was real, represented genuine behavioral change even if that change was gradual and incomplete. Maya got pregnant, gave birth to daughter, asked Rohan to be involved as uncle. He showed up on time to hospital when the baby was born, was present for early visits, maintained involvement as the child grew. The punctuality wasn't perfect but it was substantially better than his historical pattern, demonstrated that he'd actually changed rather than just making empty promises about changing. Maya noticed, mentioned that she appreciated his efforts, that his presence mattered to her and her family. Professional opportunities slowly improved as Rohan's reputation for reliability improved alongside his actual reliability. The improvement was gradual. Trust that's been degraded through chronic lateness rebuilds slowly through demonstrated consistency rather than through immediate restoration. But clients who'd stopped working with him began cautiously engaging again, began giving him smaller projects to see whether he'd follow through, began providing larger opportunities when he demonstrated improved reliability. His identity was shifting from brilliant but unreliable towards simply competent and generally reliable. The shift involved giving up some aspects of self-concept he'd invested heavily in, the performance of being too creative and interesting to be constrained by conventional time management, the philosophical justifications that had made his lateness seem sophisticated rather than inconsiderate, the subtle superiority he'd felt toward people who were punctual and organized. But the shift also involved gaining something. Actual reliability, ability to maintain commitments, capacity to show up for people who mattered to him, relationships based on mutual respect rather than on others' grudging tolerance of his behavior. The trade-off was worth it, was obviously worth it in retrospect even though it had been difficult to recognize while he'd been defending his chronic lateness as liberation rather than acknowledging it as self-sabotage. Time doesn't argue. It simply moves on. Doesn't wait for you to acknowledge its passage, doesn't pause for your explanations about why you couldn't be punctual, doesn't restore opportunities you missed through chronic lateness. Just continues flowing forward, carrying events and relationships and possibilities along with it, leaving behind people who couldn't or wouldn't respect its constraints. This isn't mystical truth about time having agency or consciousness. Is just recognition that consequences accumulate whether or not you're paying attention to them, that treating time as infinitely flexible eventually reveals that it isn't, that assuming opportunities will remain perpetually available eventually confronts reality that they don't. Vincent's cafe closed. Maya's wedding ceremony started without Rohan's presence. Professional contracts were awarded to consultants who showed up on time. These weren't time punishing Rohan for disrespecting it, were just natural consequences of time continuing to flow while Rohan was treating it as something that would accommodate his convenience. The philosophical justifications that chronic late people develop, time is a construct, creative people don't follow schedules, punctuality is conformist submission to arbitrary control, are almost always just defensive rationalizations for inconsiderate behavior that could be changed if the person actually prioritized others' time over their own convenience. Time is partially a social construct in the sense that how we measure and organize it reflects collective agreements. But the fact that we've collectively agreed that meetings start at specified times doesn't make lateness to those meetings into sophisticated rebellion, it just makes it rude. Being on time is fundamentally about respecting other people, acknowledging that their time is valuable, demonstrating that you take your commitments to them seriously, showing that their convenience matters to you as much as your own convenience matters to you. Chronic lateness communicates the opposite, that you consider your time more valuable than theirs, that your convenience justifies their inconvenience, that your commitments to them aren't actually binding in ways that would require sacrificing your own preferences. So if you're someone who's chronically late, if you've developed elaborate justifications for why your lateness is actually sophisticated liberation rather than simple inconsiderateness, if you've been losing relationships and opportunities through your failure to respect other people's time, consider that maybe the justifications are just excuses. Consider that maybe being on time is basic courtesy rather than conformist oppression. Consider that maybe the time you're losing through your lateness isn't infinite, that opportunities don't remain perpetually available, that people eventually stop waiting for you and move on. The behavioral change is possible but requires giving up the identity you've constructed around being someone who's above conventional time management. Requires acknowledging that your lateness has been harmful rather than rebellious. Requires actually prioritizing other people's time over your own convenience. Requires using tools, watches, calendars, alarms, whatever works, to create external structure that compensates for your internal tendency to lose track of time. The change won't be immediate or perfect. Rohan still struggles with punctuality 2 years after buying his watch, still sometimes falls into old patterns, still has to actively work to override his habitual lateness. But he's substantially better than he was, has rebuilt some relationships and created new opportunities through improved reliability, has given up the defensive superiority he used to feel about his lateness in exchange for actual ability to show up for people who matter to him. Time doesn't argue. It simply moves on. Show up before it leaves without you. Be StoryWise.